Section 24 of The Beginning of the Middle Ages by Richard William Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. Results of the Breakup of the Frank Empire, Part 3. Italy, Imperial Italy, within whose borders it was ever held that an emperor must receive his crown, had acquired from the policy of Charles the Great an increased importance among the new nations. It awoke at his death to the desire of independence, a desire never to be extinguished, but which it was to take long ages to fulfill. Italy was still divided, as in the days of the Lombard kings, into a number of lordships, great and small. Each of the three grandsons of Charles the Great, either personally or in their children, had with the dignity of emperor claimed to hold Italy. With Charles the Fat, in 888, it was lost to the Carolingian family. Then it seemed as if the days of the Lombards, whose name had not yet perished from the style of the kings of Italy, were coming back again. The dukes of two of the old Lombard kingdoms, Berengar of Friuli in the north, Guido of Spoleto in the centre, became rival claimants for the kingdom of Italy, such as it had been before Charles overthrew the Lombard Desiderius. For 60 years of turbulence and war, the kingdom was fought for by pretenders, Italians, and foreigners from Provence and Burgundy. Rome was either in the hands of the popes, or of the people of Rome, or of some daring lords of the neighbourhood who called themselves consuls or patricians. In this disorder, Italy was but in the same condition as Germany or Gaul. But no Hugh Capet or Henry of Saxony was to arise and lay the foundations of a national kingdom in Italy. At Rome lay the spell which drew the invader. At Rome were the great universal interests which gave him good reason or pretext for coming. Rome was the seat where emperors were wont to sit, and it was the emperor's first business to protect, to purify, to do right at Rome. And at the end of the Carolingian times and the beginning of the 10th century, Rome was at the lowest depths of disorder and shame. Charles had come to deliver Rome and the popes from the oppression of the Lombard kings. In the middle of the 10th century, Otto, the greatest of German kings since Charles, claiming Charles's place and title, descended from the Alps to deliver Rome from scandalous popes and tyrannous nobles. More romantic than Charles, he came also to deliver and to marry a distressed and widowed queen, the good and beautiful Adelheid of Provence, whom the Lombard usurper, Berengar, as he is called, wished to force into a distasteful marriage. Otto extinguished again, as Charles had done, the power and claims of the Italian or Lombard king of Pavia and Verona, Adelard's enemy, the second Berengar. Crowned king of the Italians at Milan in 951, he was crowned emperor of the Romans by the Pope at Rome in 962. He confirmed the rights of the Roman See, but he asserted in large terms those of the empire, and he had his young son Otto II also crowned emperor by the Pope in 967. But his coming, though it brought with it something of restored order, and also prepared the way for a reformed popedom, destroyed the chance of an Italian state. His coming riveted Italy to the empire, and the empire was henceforth to be kept in German hands, as the Papacy was for the most part kept in Italian. By the coronation of Otto, the two great powers were finally established, which, as it was supposed then and for ages afterwards, were indispensably necessary to govern the temporal and spiritual order of the world, the Holy Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Church. Instead of governing the world between them, as Charles and Otto dreamed, they were soon to meet in irreconcilable and fatal conflict. Between them, Italy was torn to pieces by domestic strife, and became the natural and accustomed prey of strangers, coming of their own accord or invited from within. For a short interval there arose the turbulent and brilliant liberty of the cities. Then came the tyrants, the Scaligers, the Visconti, the Sforzas, the Medici, the Borgias, the Farnese, and then the days of the foreign dynasties. But never since Otto clenched the work of Charles till our own times has it been possible for Italy to be what her sister nations were. Modern nations were consolidated and bound together in their early stages, not always by the power, but by the idea and the presence of the crown. And the crown of Italy, the iron crown of Lombardy, the golden crown of the empire, was always in the keeping of a stranger. What the 5th and 6th centuries were to the Teutonic nations, Goths, Franks, Burgundians, the period of the beginnings of their settled national life, this the 9th and 10th centuries were to the second great line of barbarian movements, the Scandinavian and Slav nations. It was the time which brought them to rest in the seats which they were henceforth to occupy. From wanderers, marauders, invaders, they did not indeed at once pass into citizens, but they became settlers, finding homes and founding a country in lands which were for the future to be called after their names. They did not, like the Franks and Goths, or even as much as the Anglo-Saxons, come into a heritage prepared for them by an older cultivation, a land of farms and vineyards, of cities and the arts of peace. And this doubtless affected their history, and caused that comparative rudeness which clings still to the east of North Europe. But they felt the influence of a more fixed order in the organized nations beyond them. From mere tribes and hordes, they began to shape themselves into dukedoms and kingdoms. Around the great central state, the empire, mainly German and in German hands, which represented the power and law of Western Europe, the names and boundaries and rude political efforts of realms afterwards to be famous began to appear. But as in the case of Hungary just referred to, they appear only in very obscure forms and dim outlines. The Northmen, not only in what is now Denmark, but in what are now Norway and Sweden, were beginning to be welded together into distinct nations under the strong and fierce discipline of ambitious kings, like Harold Haarfager, the fair-haired, and his family, Eric Bloodaxe, Haakon, and Olaf, 863-1000. The successes of their countrymen who had won provinces and founded princely houses, the familiarity which their adventures had given them with the state and power of the emperors and kings of Christendom, turned their thoughts from the mere excitement of a rover's life to the desire of founding dominions at home, and bringing under the king's authority not merely the military service, but the loose independence and the landed tenure of their wild countrymen. The attempts caused much resistance and great emigrations, but the kings carried their point. They became rulers over subjects. Wars did not cease, but they became more and more national ones, replacing piracy and private adventures. And the 3 Scandinavian kingdoms, as we know them, were formed, frequently united more or less under a conqueror like Canute, but always separate as nations. While the Northmen were shaping themselves into organized states among the mountains and on the fjords of Norway, the lakes of Sweden, and the heaths and islands of Denmark, the same thing was taking place in the vast wilderness of pine forest, marshes, and boundless plains south and east of the Baltic. We begin to see on the historical map of Europe, amid the crowd of ill-understood and forgotten names with which it is studded from the Oder and the Vistula to the Volga, belonging mostly to different branches of the great Slav family, 2 designations emerging, which were of no more account at the time than those around them, but which announced the beginning of 2 of the most famous nations of the modern world. Between the Slav races of strange names who were to become Lithuanians, Prussians, Pomeranians, Letts to the north, Slovaks to the south, Czechs in Bohemia and Moravia, another branch begins to change the name of Lech, Jaachen, for that of Polacks, Poles, meaning in their own language the people of the plains, the great plains of the Vistula. In the middle of the 9th century we begin to hear of Polish chiefs. At the end of the 10th there had arisen a Polish kingdom under a powerful and victorious king, Boleslaus, 992 to 1025. Here its history begins, so full of turbulence and incorrigible anarchy within, of aggression and tyrannous insolence without, and perhaps of all histories the most pathetic at its close. Again in the northeast, another name which was to become that of a mighty people, the natural antagonist of Poland, first its victim and then its destroyer, began to be distinguished. That famous name first appears in Greek and Latin writers of the 9th century in the shape of an indeclinable word, hoiros tauros, the Rus, as if it stood for some unimaginable abstraction. It soon became familiar at Constantinople as the name of sea rovers whose fleets from the rivers of the Black Sea insulted and threatened the great capital. The early history of the Russians is dim and vague, but it seems almost certain that the process which created England and Normandy created that which was to become Russia. Scandinavian pirates and adventurers had become known on the Baltic coast, the Varangian Sea, for their daring ferocity and strength. They were called in or they conquered, they established themselves among the Finnish and Slav tribes, they became masters and rulers, either as a dynasty or as a race. They gradually adopted, like the Normans, the speech of their Slav subjects. In a corner of that endless plain which stretches from Germany to the steppes of the Tartars and Mongols and thence to China, and of which the natural divisions are not mountains, but the streams, hundreds of miles in length, of deep and broad rivers, we hear of Rurik and of his 2 brothers about 862. They were Northmen, or as the Slavonians called them, Varangians, the name by which the northern bodyguard of the Greek emperors was known, who settled at Novgorod as the Jutes settled in Kent, and then Rollo at Rouen. The Russian Varangians conquered round about them, like their kindred in England and Gaul. They pushed southward, driving the Turkish Khazars from Kiev on the Dnieper, and making Kiev and Novgorod their chief cities. Their northern habits prompted them to use the great rivers for trade and war. By the Dnieper they carried on a brisk commerce with the Greek Empire, and 4 times between 865 and 1043 their flotillas sailed to the Bosphorus, ravaging its shores, and were beaten off with difficulty and loss. At this time arose the strange prophecy vouched for at the time that in the last days the Russians should become masters of Constantinople. The family of Rurik appears in the dim history as the counterpart to that of Rollo. Chief after chief kept up the inheritance of strength and the tradition of enterprise, and even ill fortune did not check them. One of them, Svatoslav, 955 to 973, attempted Constantinople by land. He was outmaneuvered and driven back to the Danube by the Greek emperor, the Armenian John Tzimiskes. Surrounded on all sides and without hope of escape, he was forced to capitulate and sign a humbling treaty, just as long afterwards Peter the Great, hemmed in on the Prut by the Ottomans, was compelled to buy his release by ignominious conditions in 1711. But Svatislav's defeat did not hinder, any more than that of Peter, the growth of the nation under his successors. After a short interval of bloody domestic war, he was followed, as great prince, by the great Vladimir, 973 to 1015, the conqueror, the legislator, the builder of cities and founder of schools, who holds in the traditions of Russia the place held in England by Alfred and on the continent by Charles the Great and Otto. And about this time, the 9th and 10th centuries, had come over all these races a change as great as that of their political organization, and closely connected with it. In these centuries, says Gibbon, the reign of the gospel and of the church was extended over Bulgaria, Hungary, Bohemia, Saxony, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Poland, and Russia. Their conversion went along with their introduction to civil life and order. Zealous and self-devoted missionaries, usually monks from the west or east, carrying their lives in their hands, first came preaching to men who were becoming ashamed and alarmed at their barbarism, in the face of a civilization of which they felt the strength. In time, the chiefs, from conviction, from feeling, or from imitation of the kings of the Franks and the emperor of the Greeks, were baptized. They encouraged the preachers of Christianity, and sometimes enforced the profession of it by violence and penalties. But its spread was certain when it once began. It was brought to Denmark and Sweden by a devoted monk of Corbeil on the Weser, Anchar, 826-865. The kings alternately protected and opposed it, till at length it was firmly planted under Canute. Introduced into Norway from England, it was imposed upon their people by the two kings, Olaf Tryggvason, 955-1000, and Olaf the Saint, 1019-1033. The apostles of the Bulgarians, Cyril and Methodius, 862-885, were also the teachers of the Moravians and Bohemian Czechs. In 966, Mstislav, Duke of the Poles, was baptized. But among the Slav Wends between the Elbe and the Oder, the efforts of the German emperors to Christianize them called forth a fierce revolt, 983-1066, and among them the missionaries had met little but martyrdom. Finally, in 988, the powerful Vladimir of Russia, whose grandmother Olga had already brought Christianity from Constantinople to Kiev in 955, was baptized at Cherson and received as his bride the Greek emperor's daughter. Russia henceforth became the great conquest and strength of the Eastern Church. The conversion of these last formed of the barbarian nations altered their relation to Europe. The admission, says Gibbon, of the barbarians into the pale of civil and ecclesiastical society delivered Europe from the depredations by sea and land of the Normans, Hungarians, and Russians. The establishment of law and order was promoted by the influence of the clergy, and the rudiments of art and science were introduced into the savage countries of the globe. End of section 24. Section 25 of The Beginning of the Middle Ages by Richard William Church. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11. Retrospect of the times of transition from the Roman Empire to the European states of the Middle Ages. The history of the 5 centuries from the end of the 5th to the end of the 10th is the history of the efforts of the new nations of the West after organization, improvement, and power. During this period, the Teutonic races found themselves under entirely new conditions. It had not been new to them to conquer or to meet other races. They had already, in what we call their barbarous state, definite social usages and a kind of political organization. But for the first time they found themselves in close and permanent contact with an older and more perfect civil order and a new religion. They found themselves in their ignorance and inexperience, in their eager curiosity and vigorous freshness of life, in contact with Roman learning and Roman art, in some parts with Roman institutions and Roman laws. And they found themselves under the spell of the mightiest, the tenderest, and most wonderful of religions. Thus all that had been the familiar course of life during centuries of wandering was changed. Wild as they still were, they settled. They became lords of lands and houses. They began to learn and to know. They began to feel themselves becoming a commonwealth and a state. And by the end of the 10th century, the process in its broad and essential points was accomplished. The outlines of the new world that was to be had become distinctly and permanently laid down. It had been doubtful whether it was to be Goths or Franks who were to be at the head of the new state of things, to give it its tone, to direct and control it. It had been the Franks and not the Goths. It had been doubtful whether Catholic or Arianism was to be the religion of the West. Arianism had disappeared and had left perhaps too easy a victory to the Catholic Church. Again, it had been doubtful whether the new nations could stand the shock of barbarian pressure outside and behind them, whether Europe might not be, like Africa and Asia, a prey to the Saracens, whether the Northmen from the sea and the Huns and Slavs from the deserts might not desolate and sweep away the homes which Frank and Goth and Anglo-Saxon had made for themselves. The deluge had been stayed, not without loss, but for good and all. The Saracen had maimed wounded Christendom in one of its finest kingdoms. He had spoilt, though not finally destroyed, the hopes of Spain. He long continued to annoy and threaten the shores of Italy, to penetrate even the passes of the Alps. But the Saracen had been arrested forever by Charles Martel at Poitiers and Narbonne, by Charles the Great at the Ebro. The Northmen, the Slavs, even the Huns or Magyars had been drawn into civilization which they had disturbed but could not overthrow. The imperfect civilization of the time had proved itself strong enough not only to check them, but to react upon them. It had been doubtful whether the New World were not to be an extension of Germany from the Rhine over the whole west and south to the Atlantic and Mediterranean. Further, it seemed at one time uncertain whether German speech and German law were not to prevail in Gaul and Italy, as they had prevailed in Britain, supplanting the older languages and laws, or driving them out into the wastes or the mountains. Whether a great German reproduction of the Roman Empire, with its twin capitals of Aachen and Rome, were not to be supreme in the world. But this was not to be. The strength of the older society and of the races in possession had reasserted itself. Germany was indeed to be a great and mighty nation, but it was not to absorb the world. The Frank Empire of Charles the Great was too loosely compacted to hold together as he had created it. It broke up and was reconstituted in a different and very contracted shape. The Holy Roman Empire of the Saxon, Otto the Great, the empire as it was to continue until the beginning of this century, often a very important but ambiguous and uncertain element in the polity of Christendom. The lands where the Romans had been strong were once more to show the influence of their imperishable language and thought. Italy was once more Italy and not Lombardy, but its destiny to be kingless, except with the mock title of a foreign and often hostile ruler, had declared itself. It was no longer doubtful that Western France, so long the battleground between Latin and German influences, was to be Latin and not German. It had finally shaken itself loose from Germany. It took a king out of its own great chieftains, and rejected the half-Teutonic line of Charles the Great. It was to grow and become great under the kings of Paris, and not under the kings of Laon, much less of Aachen. The great Norse settlement on the Seine had become thoroughly Latin. The combination of astuteness and practical good sense with the old adventurousness and daring of their blood, which was to make the Normans seek crowns in England, in Italy, and in the East, had already shown itself in the remarkable line of the Dukes of Normandy. And by the end of the 10th century, England had taken its shape and established its internal unity. Angles of the East, North, and Midland, Saxons of the West and South, even the intrusive Norse settlers of the Danish districts, had become permanently bound together under the kings of the line of Egbert: Alfred, Edward the Elder, Athelstan, Edgar. They had become that English folk and English kin who were soon twice to be made subjects of foreign conquest and to be ruled by lines of foreign kings, but who were to turn their conquerors, even Normans, in a generation or two, into Englishmen. Finally, with the year 999, with Gerbert of Auvergne, the austere Cluniac monk, the most learned man of his time, mathematician, theologian, supposed wizard, magician, tutor of a Roman emperor and of a king of France, ecclesiastical intriguer and ecclesiastical victim, the stout opponent, the stout asserter of the claims of the Roman See, placed in it as a reforming pope by the title of Sylvester II, through the influence of the Roman emperor Otto III. A new line of popes begins. We have left behind the popes who cringed to the Carolingian princes when they were strong, and threatened them when they were weak. We have left behind the creatures of profligate women and their associates. There are still some 40 years to come of the licentious or simoniacal nominees of the Counts of Tusculum, but the German emperors on the one hand, the monks of Cluny on the other, had already embraced strongly the idea of what the Pope ought to be, and this idea, which was to give to the popedom its modern importance, was on the eve of being realized. Thus the present sketch has been brought down to the Middle Ages. In 962, Otto the Great was crowned emperor at Rome, and the medieval empire began. In 975 was the end of the powerful and peaceful reign of Edgar, who left a united England which his son Ethelred was to lose through misgovernment, and the stranger was to conquer and spoil, but which neither could destroy or disintegrate. In 987, Hugh Capet became king of France. In 995 ended the long reign of 50 years of Richard, Duke of Normandy, the reign which had seen such great revolutions, in which Normandy had thrown its sword into the balance between Germany and France, and had determined the victory of the Dukes of Paris, a reign which left Normandy the most vigorous province of Gaul, full of intellectual activity and ambition. We are not far from the Crusades. The seeds of feudalism have been thickly sown and have taken deep root. We are not far from the strife of investitures, the eventful quarrel between Pope and Emperor, Gregory VII and Henry IV. We are not far from the beginning of the scholastic philosophy, from Berengarius and Lanfranc, Anselm and Abelard. We are not far from those massy and solemn churches in Normandy, Germany, France and England, in which the architecture of the Middle Ages took its beginning, and which stand the enduring monuments of what the new nations had grown to be, of the ideas of power, strength and grandeur which had been developed among them, and to which they sought to give expression. End of section 25. Recording by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, January 2021. End of The Beginning of the Middle Ages by Richard William Church.